Great. Thank you so much, Anthony. And thank you, Sarah, for joining us
Thanks.
today. It's a real pleasure. We were just chatting before the webinar began. I had the pleasure of attending an event in Sarah's book talk for this book, which I have here. In New Haven, there's a lovely little community bookshop called Possible Futures. And so I got a chance to see a kind of community engagement with Sara's book. And it's lovely to have this opportunity to talk with you some more about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabelle. And to everybody for being here with us. Really, really appreciate it.
So I thought maybe we just start by thinking about the fact that this is a book for general readers. You've written many books over many years that have these kind of beautiful, it's all within a conversation. And so as I was reading this book and some of the ideas were really, familiar to me as someone who's familiar with some of your other work, I was wondering, what was it like to draw on so many years of work and so many books to create a new form? And why did you choose to write a handbook for general readers?
Well, that's a really good question. And before I answer, I just want to acknowledge that we're living and speaking during very violent times. At times, it's quite hard to do the work that we're doing. Of course, referring to the genocide in Gaza. So just solidarity with Free Palestine and with everyone fighting for Free Palestine. But yeah, the Killjoy has been a kind of life companion, traveling companion, and research companion for some time. But when I first began writing about the Killjoy, I was still an academic working within the university. I was writing for other feminists, always feminist students, feminist readers, feminist academics, but I was publishing academic books with a university press.
Mm-hmm.
And when I made a decision to leave my job, not just my post, but my profession and work independently, I just began to reflect on how I was writing and where I was publishing and who I was reaching and who I wasn't. So my aim really in writing a trade book was to write a book that would be more accessible. And, one way a book is more accessible is for it to be cheaper. And that's very important. So the US Handbook isn't out yet, but in the UK, we finally have, I fulfilled my life ambition of being cheaper. It's finally got a book that's under £10. And that kind of really mattered to me, to have a book that was accessible, because, I really believe in the transformative power of feminist ideas, but I'm not working in the classroom, at least as it's traditionally understood. And so I wanted to find a way to reach readers more directly. So hence a trade book. And I decided to do a trade book with the Feminist Killjoy because I'd found that wherever I spoke, whoever I spoke to, the Feminist Killjoy was one of the figures that seemed to spark most recognition. People would be like, oh, I've been that person who gets in the way because they point to a problem. And I've been that person who becomes the problem because of what they point to. So there was a sense that the Feminist Killjoy was quite a good way of communicating with people. So I thought if I was going to write a book with a commercial press, and there are issues with that, but if that's what I was going to do, then I would make the Feminist Killjoy my way of communicating and sharing the ideas. And the handbook, it's a feminist killjoy handbook, so it's not like a traditional handbook. It's not about telling you how to be a feminist killjoy in 5 clear bullet points. I'm really sorry if that's what people are expecting, but it's not that. But it is I think of the handbook very much as a kind of handle or a hand, a kind of feminist hand. It can be really difficult and isolating to be the cause of other people's unhappiness, especially if we're talking about those to whom we have affection, those relationships that matter to us. So, it's really, really helpful to have companions and solidarity as we live our life in recognition of that figure. And I wanted to provide a book that would be that. It would give people a sense of companionship and connection, and also really stress in a way I haven't stressed before, that however hard it can be to be the killjoy, it can also be how we acquire certain skills and insights that actually help us to handle difficult situations, because we realize that actually if we point to the problem and we become the problem, we are not the problem. It allows us to problematize who becomes the problem, and that can actually be quite freeing.
Thank you so much for that. There's many different ways we could go from there. But maybe we'll just linger with that, thinking about becoming what happens when you become the problem for someone you have some bond to, attachment to. Because you tell the opening of this book is a story that you tell in other work of yours, but I think it's really relatable because it's in the context of a family, your family growing up. And you often tell this as a kind of genesis story of the feminist killjoy for you, sitting at the dinner table. And so I'm wondering maybe you could tell that story for any listeners who are not familiar with it. But then I also wanted to highlight a line that really stuck out to me when I was rereading it this time. You say we always take up you're setting the scene, and you say we always take up the same seats as if we are securing more than our place. So I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate on that line as well, and what it foreshadows about the feminist killjoy who's about to come onto the scene.
Yeah, I mean, I told that story of becoming a feminist killjoy quite a lot of different times, but each time in a slightly different way. And one of the killjoy joys of writing the handbook was actually revisiting the themes of the past. And I sometimes feel like it's almost like when you go back and you look back at things that happened to you, perhaps as a child or a young person, with new concepts and new terms, it does allow you to see things differently, and there can be a degree of freedom, but also creativity in that. It's not just always the same thing. And yet, when I go back to that story, it's interesting that the sentence that you highlighted, as if we're securing more than our place. So my story of becoming a feminist killjoy, I often begin with the table, and there are a lot of tables in my work, and I'm a bit obsessed with tables. It's another story of how I became so. But my family would be often seated at the table for dinner, and it would be very much about having polite conversations, where only certain things would be brought up. And my father would say something problematic, and I would try really hard not to react, but he's winding me up, and I'm getting frustrated because I'm being wound up by somebody winding me up. So maybe I say something, but then my mother would roll her eyes and say, "Oh, Sara, another dinner ruined." So it's almost as if by just saying something and by referring to the problem in what somebody else is saying, you're bringing it into existence, and you sort of ruin the dinner or ruin the atmosphere. And when I was sort of writing about happiness, I remembered these experiences of being the feminist killjoy around the table, and I began to think of them not just as moments of a personal biography, but as telling us something about how structures work. Because in a way, what's really important about that is that I had a sense of taking up a very particular position as the problem child, the one who wasn't willing to go along with my father and to say yes, to say that he had a right to be right. And the trouble with that is, however much you need to say it, to point to the injustice perhaps of what he is saying, the consequences give you less room. You can feel the withdrawal of affection from the other members of the family. You can feel yourself being isolated, and it's almost like you would disappear. And that there's a way in which it's not simply about naming the problem and being liberated by it. That act, it can actually lead, it has consequences that can be very, very difficult. And I began to sort of think a lot about that the image of the happy family is so much telling us to contain some of those truths that I eventually called killjoy truths, those experiences of violence in the family or difficulties in the family or disagreements or divisions. You're not supposed to say anything. If you do say something, you keep it quiet, you keep it a secret. And there's a way in which I think that theme is something that I took much with me as I began to work on institutions themselves, the way in which loyalty is often about keeping quiet about the problems with the institution, that your loyalty is being willing to tell the story that the institution is happy, and that you end up, I call it, you become an institutional closet, willing to hold the secrets. And the killjoy kind of lets them out, and there are consequences, but you also, through that process of seeing the structures and how they work, you come to know the world in a different way, and that leads you on a path those seemingly small situations of disagreements around the table can lead you on a path towards a different understanding of your place in the world.
Yeah. What you say about loyalty reminds me of the story that you tell about your colleague when you decided to leave your institution. You talk about this as a moment of feminist snap. But you tell the story of a colleague who essentially, I don't know that she used the word, like she said that you were disloyal, but there was a real kind of accusation that you were being unloyal to specifically the feminists, that because she considered herself a feminist. And we've worked so hard at this institution to be feminist or do this thing, and your leaving disrupted that for her and was a kind of a disloyalty to her sense of feminism. And you talk about this as a moment, I guess, of, I'm now remembering, of killing feminist joy. So it seems like there can be feminist institutional closets as well. Would you say that that's?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I definitely. And I kind of like became very, very interested in that when I spoke out publicly so that people knew that there had been inquiries into sexual harassment, if I hadn't said anything, people probably still wouldn't know about it, that these inquiries had happened. That was seen not only as disloyal to the institution, and you would kind of expect that the way in which public relations gets used, and there's a lot of repair work. Oh, we are really a progressive institution. We really do value diversity and equality. We don't tolerate sexual harassment, except they did. But you don't really, or I didn't really, should accept that didn't happen, expect that some of my feminist colleagues would equally have understood that act of disclosure, public disclosure, as damaging, not just to the institution, but to feminism. And I think that's partly because some colleagues thought that the institution's reputation as being a feminist institution would be at risk, and people would hear about the sexual harassment, so they wouldn't fear about all that critical feminist work. And then you begin to realize how investing in an institution as a feminist institution means going along with suppressing the realities of sexual harassment and sexual violence that are taking place within the institution. She also called me unprofessional, and that's why I now call myself an unprofessional feminist. We turn the judgment into the project. And I think that, when I'm describing the ways in which feminists see that disclosures about harassment or institutional violence as damaging, I'm sort of also describing kind of how liberal feminism is functioning, that perhaps you will get more resources from the institution if you're willing to be silent about its complicity in violence. Perhaps some women will be able to become more senior or become professors to the extent that they are willing not to talk about institutions and institutional violence. They can perhaps critique institutional violence over there, but not here, where they are and where their rewards and promotional structures are. So yes is the answer to that question.
Yes. Yeah. And I guess I'll just take a moment here to say as well that I appreciate you mentioning the context of violence in the world right now, what the structure that you're describing about the way that institutions handle people who are speaking out as problems has certainly been the case at Yale, and it's part of the structure of the violence that we're seeing in the world right now. So just wanted to thank you also for starting us off in that way. So many things to think about. I guess let's think about maybe this assignment, the turning the assignment into a project, right? Or so that when you're called an unprofessional, you become an unprofessional feminist. There's a way I think that this is related to what you call feminist Killjoy commitments in the book. So there's a kind of appendix of commitments, and one of the things that's very exciting for me about those commitments is what you're doing with the language of commitment. So we often think of commitments as saying I will or I promise to, but feminist Killjoy commitments take the form I am willing to. And I think that this is an important move that you're making, but I wonder if you can explain it for us a little bit and help us think about how commitments are related to not only ideas and actions, but also to people, in part because some of these, what we've been talking about, the kind of like sense of disloyalty or something is often like rendered on a personal level or something like that. Like you've done something wrong to me personally if I feel like you're being a feminist killjoy.
This is a really, really good question. And, before I answer, I just want to think a little bit about like what it means to turn that judgment into a project. In a way, I kind of making kind of joke about it, like, now I call myself an unprofessional feminist. Like, I laugh myself when I say that. And there is something about like taking it on, that it changes the energy and the feeling of the judgment. But there's a whole kind of critical set of works that we need to be doing. And I think of the late Palestinian scholar activist Edward Said spoke a lot about professionalism as a problem. In his Reith lectures, he says professionalism means not rocking the boat, doing what is marketable, doing what is presentable. So I sort of, there's a way in which you're turning a professional from a judgment and you're taking it on, but you're also doing the work of working through what that actually involves and what that requires giving up. That actually to refuse to be professional is also about willing to actually risk your position, and that can be difficult. But I have learned that from the work I did on complaint, that some of the most precarious people are the most willing to risk their situation, their security, and that there seems to be that people become very, very invested in being professional because with silence comes promotion. But there's a lot of risks attached to being unprofessional. And so we have to find ways to be collective about it and to share in the risks of doing that. And so in terms of commitments, when I think about commitment, I think a lot about Audre Lorde. I mean, I think about Audre Lorde's work all the time. And I've just been reading Alexis Pauline Gumbs' a beautiful new biography. Okay. I love this book so much. Oh, I got the UK edition. So this is like my number one Killjoy survival tip, is to go and read this book. It's beautiful. When I think about commitment, I think about Audre Lorde. She talked about how she was talking with Adrienne Rich about how she wrote the poem Power. And it's a description that stays with me, and I've written about in the Feminist Killjoy Handbook and on my blog, where she says she's driving her car, going somewhere, doing something. And she hears about a white policeman who'd been acquitted for the murder of a black child. This is back in 1978, history, the violence of repetition. And she talks about how she's so overwhelmed by the feeling of what she's having to take in that she stops the car. And she stops the car and a poem comes out, she says, almost without craft. And it's something that I learned so much from, because in a way, what she's telling us is sometimes we have to stop what we are doing to register the impact of violence, not only so that we can take it in, the violence of white supremacy, of the police, take it in, but also so that we can express it or we can get it out. And so when I think about Killjoy commitments, I'm thinking about partly that sometimes we really know our commitments when they become inconvenient, when they require us to stop what we are doing. And when I did the research on complaint, I'm listening to people telling me stories about trying to redress forms of violence that occur in institutions. One of the things that really came up was, while realizing that for one of the real walls that people come against, it's not even the institution, its marketing department or the leaders necessarily, it's colleagues who don't want to hear about their experience because their experience will get in the way of that person's investment in a person or an institution or a project or a program. So we already know a Killjoy commitment when it is inconvenient to us, and it requires actually sometimes killing our own joy, because we have to take in something that changes our relationships to what we might otherwise have held dear. And that's really tricky. So there is expressed in the language of I'm willing to. I think in a way I'm really kind of playing with cause and effect here. So one of the Killjoy commitments is I'm willing to cause damage. So I had to be willing to cause damage when I resigned. There's no point resigning silently when I was protesting silence. So, you know, I had to be willing to cause damage. Now, that wasn't my aim, but
Right.
it was the case that disclosing the way in which institutional harassment had happened would be understood as causing damage to the institution. So, insofar as that is the effect, then I'm willing that effect. So, one of the problems of the Killjoy is that it's assumed that what you affect is what you intend. So you kill joy. Like, I don't laugh at a sexist joke because I don't want you to be happy. I don't laugh at a sexist joke because I'm unhappy, really. I'm just a miserable feminist and I can't bear anybody else to laugh. That's the stereotype. And so what we're doing is we're not saying, yes, that's true, but we're saying, if talking about sexism or not laughing at a sexist or racist or transphobic joke makes you unhappy, then I am willing to do so. So willing is about not making what we affect the cause, but just not being dissuaded by
Right.
having that effect. So I am willing to widen the range of texts being taught in a philosophy curriculum or in literary curriculum, even
Yeah.
if you understand that as vandalizing the curriculum. I don't understand that as vandalizing the curriculum. I understand it as widening, as giving us more, not less, not as cancelling, but broadening. And I'm
Mm.
not going to be dissuaded from my effort to widen the text being taught by being perceived as a vandal, the way in which so much decolonising the curriculum work is saying. So that's what I mean. You're not dissuaded by the consequences of what you do. And that's why I'm using the language of being willing to describe that moment.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Maybe thinking about the kind of widening of texts, one of the joys for me in reading this text of yours is all of the other wise feminist killjoys who you bring into the conversation. So of course, Audre Lorde is one of them. Alexis Pauline Gumbs is another. There's Bell Hooks, but then there are others that I'm less familiar with, and I just want to name some of them in case our audience members haven't had a chance to look at your book. So, and I apologize if I mispronounce any of these names, but Ama Ata Aidu, the author of Our Sister Killjoy, Suaima Manzoor Khan, Aileen Morton Robinson, Adrienne Rich, Toni Morrison, Ruby Hamad, Judith Butler, to name a few. So, a really amazing array of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and queer feminists. And you have a kind of list of them at the end, and you say this isn't a comprehensive list, but it's a place. Yeah, it's a place. I was thinking about this just a week ago or so. That one of the gifts of your book is that I can give it as a gift to students who are also looking for more reading around, not just so to expand their horizons of what they're studying in philosophy and gender studies and American studies here. So I wanted to ask you though, I mean, I think there's so much talk now about citational practice and about reading lists. And I think a lot of people, even more public audiences, have a sense of, oh, who I should be reading. And I think, at the same time, a lot of engagement in the academy and in mainstream media with Black and Brown and Indigenous and queer writers is really just at the kind of level of a gesture. Not by no means is this universal, but a lot of it is kind of just a gesture. And so I'm wondering about how the Feminist Killjoy might not only teach us who to read so that we have a sense of, oh, I need to be engaging these writers who I, weren't in the classrooms where I was learning, but also how does she teach us how to read, how to read deeply the way that you really engage deeply with these writers in this book?
And that's a really great question. I mean, I think of the texts that I cite as my companions, and the learning that I've received from them. Like I feel like I have received so much because of these texts. And I think when I think back to when I first read, for example, when I first read Audre Lorde, when I first read Bell Hooks, it was just life changing. And I often, when I think about citation, I want to go back to those moments when you first encounter texts that allow you to see the world differently. And I was brought up in Australia and went to university in Australia. I was never taught by anyone who wasn't white. we didn't learn about brown and black feminism in Australia. Even post-colonial studies was organised around white Australian writers. We didn't talk about Indigenous politics back then. And I came to the UK and did a course with Chris Whedon, and she assigned Audre Lorde and Cherry Moraga and the other writers, including people like Stuart Hall as well, Black British writers. And it was just, for me, somebody who had been growing up in Australia as a brown person in a very white neighbourhood, going to very white institutions, to read work that was about racialization, about being a body out of place in your neighbourhood. When I read From Sisters Outsider, and I read Audre Lorde saying, this is just like one short sentence from Lorde, and Lorde's wisdom is often snappy. It's very, very precise. She says, racism and sexism are growing out words. I hear so much. I heard so much in that, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, you experience them before you have the words to describe what you experience. And so when I began to read that work that gave me the words, it just allowed me to revisit so much. And actually, it was life-changing. And one of the joys of being a teacher was always teaching these texts and watching the transformation, feeling it really, not watching it, feeling the transformation in the room, especially as Black British and Brown British students read that work and began to see parts of themselves reflected in the pages where previously they might have felt they simply weren't. So I think I have often got very frustrated with citational practice. It led me in my book, Living a Feminist Life, to have a citational policy of not citing any quote unquote white men, which is a little blunt as a policy. But sometimes you need a policy to change a habit. And really what I was trying to say, that the more important line from that book, people I think were thinking I was making a lifelong commitment to a citational practice. I'm not citing that man. That wasn't the case. It was an experiment, not an instruction. Yeah. It was an experiment. And it was interesting because what it allowed me to realize is citation can become a habit, like a well-used path. It can direct you towards some and not others. And that if you don't follow those more traveled paths, you actually open up the world. You open up the lens of your own materials, and you begin to follow texts and find texts that otherwise might not have been cited or that you might not have found. You give room. You create more room. And that, for me, it's about companionship. It's about encountering texts that give words and names to problems, that allow you to revisit so much about your history and the history of those around you. And it's also about creating room and working out with each other how to create room in institutions that might otherwise seem quite hostile. So citation can be gestural or non-performative, something that you say and don't do. It can cover over. It can be a substitute for the genuine engagement. So it's definitely what I'm would be calling for is like a more sustained traveling with the texts that we encounter, and seeing them not just as books and even objects, but as a living with us in the world that we're in.
Thank you. That's lovely. I kept thinking, like, of course, it's a phenomenological approach to citational practice. I mean, in terms of thinking about paths, right? Or where it can follow, where a citation can lead you, the other conversations, other rooms it opens up. Yeah, it's lovely. And then I was just thinking about how, we both had gums in hand's reach, but there's something about like because I haven't looked as much at it as I want to, but I try to keep these texts, bell hooks, who like close by, even when I'm doing work that's not as closely as engaging with them as I would like to. Okay, so I'm thinking a little bit. Oh no, we still have some time. I mean, I guess. Well, maybe we can, because this is a philosopher magazine event, I can ask you a little bit about this question around disciplines. You say that feminists often have killjoy relationships to academic disciplines, and you have this fabulous quote from Judith Butler talking about philosophy. I certainly feel that I have a feminist Killjoy relationship to political theory. And so I'm wondering if you could say more about like why this is not unique to philosophy as a discipline, and also like, yeah, what would you say to younger students? I've been thinking about the fact that, you know, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt myself and say, I wonder what it's been like for you to not be in a classroom space anymore, assuming that you're not in the traditional academic classroom space, because I think of you as a teacher when I'm reading you, because you teach me so much. So if you feel like answering that question about students, you know, also students broadly conceived, like I'm sure you're meeting so many people in the world as you take this book on tour, who are kind of short-term students. But if you had some students in front of you who are discovering their Killjoy relationship to their own academic discipline, what might you say to them?
Wow, there's so many great questions there. I think there was a sentence in Living a Feminist Life to be a feminist is to stay a student. I kind of committed to that idea of myself being a student as well, and the path of learning from others, the task of learning from others. And because in the last decade, have been doing empirical work, you know, I'm not trained as a social scientist, but a lot of my, well, two of my most significant projects, one on diversity, one on complaint, have involved talking to people. That too, I've called it becoming a feminist ear, being willing to listen to other people's stories. I feel like so much of the conceptual work that I've been doing has come from just what I've received from others. So I do feel like I'm a student in that sense. So I'm kind of committed to being a student and staying one. But yeah, disciplines, you know, I have the chapter called The Feminist Killjoy as a Philosopher, because I wanted to really emphasize how being a killjoy, those experiences around tables, whether it's a family table or a meeting table, they can be how we know so much about the world. The point being that being alienated from something is how you begin to notice it in a different way. But, you know, I'm not a philosopher, not really a philosopher. I'm actually not a philosopher. I wanted to do philosophy, but I went to Adelaide University and it was an analytic department. And I'm very interested in a lot of analytical philosophy, but I just remember philosophy 101, lecture one, the lecturer dismissed skepticism as self-refuting. And I'm like, hang on, you're dismissing a whole body of work based on a set of arguments that maybe we need to look at the form of in order to be able to hear a little bit more about what we are dismissing. So it's like I couldn't go there. So I was actually really interested in skepticism. So I ended up doing English and history. And I wanted to do history because I wanted to do history of ideas as another way of doing philosophy. But my history of ideas person kept saying it was too philosophical. My essays were too philosophical. So I wasn't historical enough. And then when I went to do an honours degree combining English and history, the history department said my ideas weren't historical enough. So I kind of like had a sense of being a killjoy in the disciplines that I was in, that not quite at home, not quite doing something properly, just because my imagination and curiosity didn't involve accepting the edges they called disciplinary lines. So I kind of always roamed around a little bit. And there's anxiety in roaming around. You can fear being judged inadequate according to the systems internal to each discipline. And I talked a lot about that in my book, Queer Phonology. Well, not a lot, I think there's at least one endnote about that sort of anxiety. But I came to realize in time, and this is something I would say to students very much, that, you know, it's important to work through and work out the different intellectual histories from which any text emerges, but disciplines can stop us from a path that we might otherwise follow, and that if you move between them, it allows you to see things and encounter materials that might otherwise not have been available to you. And one of the kind of like killjoy truths in the handbook is that when we're not at home I use the word category, but when we're not really at home in a category, we come to know it more. So all the times I was told, "Are you really a professor?" I didn't really care at all about whether I was seen as a professor or not. That wasn't the reason I ever shared those stories. I was quite happy to be unbecome a professor. But it was more, I learned more about what it means to be a professor from not having been seen as one. Because when you are a professor, it's assumed that you are the professor, and the gaze lands upon you because they assume that you're the professor. There is so much you don't have to notice about how the world is organized to make certain bodies of knowledge stand out and be visible and not others. And so for me, like a Killjoy relation to any academic discipline can involve being uncertain or it can involve a kind of a degree of anxiety, I'll use that word, about inadequacy. And that's okay. It's probably quite good to worry about not being adequate. But it also gives you so many opportunities to see how things work, because when you are already inside something, you can easily stop seeing how it works.
Yeah. It becomes too familiar or something, right? Yeah. Well, okay, so maybe we can circle back to what you had said about taking on being a student, like, you know, that's part of what a feminist killjoy kind of has to offer, right? This idea that we're students throughout our life. And I think there's a question that I've been wanting to ask you about getting older and the way that we learn from experiences, but also sometimes if we follow a killjoy, a feminist killjoy around, you know, that the idea that she can kind of deliver these very hard truths that are, you know, not easy. So you said this is one of the consequences. It can be freeing, but it can also be a kind of burden to bear. In your book, you tell this really moving story about a moment in your life when your mother said something that was very hurtful, anti-Muslim, and it was particularly at a moment of feminist killjoy joy for you. And so you describe yourself as feeling very shattered in that moment. And then about a page later in the book, you also offer what you call a cautious remembering and some speculative thoughts about what might have been happening with her at the time. And you say that, you know, by going back to the past, we can find other stories to tell in this really powerful way. And so I also wonder, like, how does the feminist killjoy, when we go revisit the past and remember and speculate and tell other stories, all of these tensions come up between pain and compassion, maybe hurt and understanding, gentleness, but also a sense of anger, outrage. And how does the feminist killjoy help us kind of hold these feelings, thoughts that don't sit easily together?
I think that's a really good way of describing it. Feelings and thoughts that don't sit easily together. And you know, I think like once you have that feminist killjoy handy, it's not that this probably won't surprise you, but it's not that it suddenly becomes clear what to do or what to say. I think of all the times that I think of a conversation I had with a Black feminist who was saying to me, you know, I didn't make a complaint about racism. I was talking to her why, because she had experienced racism in the context of her department. She said, I didn't complain about racism because I knew who I was complaining to. There's no point complaining about a racist institution to a racist institution. So sometimes becoming a killjoy, knowing that you would become a problem for pointing out a problem, is why you don't say something. And maybe that knowledge sits uneasily because it can look a little bit like silence or compliance, but it's not. It's more you realize you have to find another way to get through, given who you are speaking to. So that too really matters. And yeah, I mean, thinking about feeling joy in relation to my own past, I found it less hard to say no and refuse my father. We don't have a relationship anymore. When I came out, he ended, well, the language I use is disowned. And of course, that's not a problematic language because it implies ownership. And when I tell people that story, they're like, that's really sad, it's your father. But like, I'm not like, no, the relationship was sad, so the ending wasn't. So for me, and you know, he wasn't a violent person. So actually having the relationship end has given me a lot of freedom. I can actually go back to Australia and not like worry about having to see this person who had such an impact on my life. But But my mother was quite different because she was very fragile, and my mother was ill since she was in her late 20s. She's just like lived with disability since she was in her late 20s. She didn't go to university. She doesn't think very much of herself. And so for her to say things that are really, really offensive to me, it's really, really hard to know what to say, because I don't want, she's so fragile. I know that if I really, really expressed how I felt, she would shatter. And yet when she says something racist to me, and she has said these things to me over time, but more recently, as she becomes angrier, I think the effect of preserving this image of happiness took a lot out of her. It's just really hard to know what to do. I mean, I sometimes, you know how when someone says something, somebody you love, they say something, and you can like hear the glass shatter. You know that something has broken, that you won't be able to put back together again. But you have a love for that person and a knowledge of how hard it has been for them, and that maybe you've had things that they haven't, that you have a confidence that they might not have had because of worlds that were not open to them but were open to you. And then I think you become very, very cautious, and that is a kind of feeling of holding things together that don't sit easily. And I think it's really important to pay attention to that, because I think, you know, I've often said this about complaints. There can be a real clarity in complaint, because sometimes people have talked to me about how they've tried not to notice the violence that's being done to them, because really taking it in would mean giving something up. I think of a queer woman of colour, from a working class background. She fought really hard to be where she is, but her supervisor was harassing her. It was only when he sent her naked photos of his genitals, and not only she, but her colleague saw this photo, and she saw that her colleague saw that it was wrong, that she really let it in. And then so much shattered, because she realized that she couldn't be there anymore, this place that she fought really hard to. So it can be really, really hard to get to that point where we let some things in. But I think for me, part of ambivalence is just working out how do we do that, because sometimes we do need to not notice certain things, because we're at work. You've got to focus, you've got to function, and so we put things to aside that are difficult, but then we've got to work out how to let them in, how to take them in, and what we can take on. And I think we only do that work collectively and collaboratively. And so for me, a story about ambivalence is also a story about connection, making connections that give us the strength to be able to do the work of letting ourselves fall apart, so that we can put ourselves back together again with other people.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. I want to get to some Q&A. Maybe very briefly, I can ask you, on this note of collectivity, for you to just tell us a little bit about the three people that this book is dedicated to. So you dedicate it to your friend, is it Nyla?
Nyla,
and then your Auntie Gulzar and Bell Hooks. And so maybe you could just tell us briefly about those three people, and then I'll ask a few questions from the Q&A.
Neela was a very dear friend of mine who took their own life, actually, as I was writing the chapter on survival. Neela was very committed to trans of colour freedom and justice, disability justice, did not get the support they needed to live their life. Like me, was absolutely engaged with Audre Lorde's work on survival, would have just absolutely loved this book. And, you know, the thing that Neela did, when I left my job, it was actually really hard. You know, I really loved my job. It's not like, I know it sounds like, oh, I'm resigning if there was protest. It sounds bold. I didn't feel bold. I felt sad and shattered. And I think Neela was one of the people who really knew that. And Neela would always send me photos of their cat Gertz, and I would send Neela photos of Poppy. I'm sorry, Bluebell wasn't here then. And there's something about that. And Neela always turned up. Everything I did, Neela, if they could, would turn up. And I really, when I think about Killjoy commitment, Neela comes to mind. Gulzar Bano was my auntie. She died maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. My auntie Gulzar was a Muslim feminist in Pakistan. She was a poet, so the chapter specific on poetry is dedicated to her. And she sort of taught me a lot about feminism. So my idea of feminism came from Pakistan. It came from a Muslim woman who taught me that my mind is my own, and gave me who gave me her life as an image of freedom, of living your life. She didn't have like children or get married, so we always sort of saw ourselves as having a kind of like twin connection. And Bell Hooks, I think most of you know, I was always wanting to write to Bell a letter about how much her work meant to me. And I just think Bell Hooks always nailed it. She always named it, you know, white supremacist, heterosexist, capitalist, patriarchy. She always named it. And I draw much Killjoy inspiration from her.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, I'm going to ask a few questions from the Q&A. I'm hoping to put two together, both from anonymous attendees. One asked if you could talk a little bit more about affect and the place of anger in the Killjoy stance. And another asked about if you could clarify some of the ways you use phenomenology as a method. So I'm asking these two together because I think of affect and phenomenology as key parts of your method.
Yeah, these are interesting questions. You know, we were at Lancaster in women's studies when I was there when I was writing the cultural politics of emotion, which came out 20 years ago. It's like, really? That's so long. That's so long. And Lauren Gallant came to Lancaster over a couple of different years as the Lever Hume visiting person, and we were in discussion about public emotions and public feeling. And I feel like a lot of the work that I did on affect and emotion came out of those discussions, and indeed out of quite a long-standing tradition in feminist philosophy, as well as Black feminism, of thinking through emotion, thinking of emotions as both cognitive and embodied. So when we think about affect theory, I kind of like am very, very interested in a lot of the work that comes under that rubric, but I never really thought of myself as doing affect theory in that way. I kind of see myself as coming out of a slightly different set of traditions, especially inspired, as I said, by Audre Lorde's work. And that did include quite a strong emphasis on anger. I love Lorde's description. Again, notice the wisdom in this very apparently simple formulation. Anger is loaded with information and energy. It tells us something about the world. It gives us a capacity to move against it or to say no to it. So I think there is a way in which the Killjoy is trying to sort of think about what are ordinary and sort of negative emotions in more creative ways. But it's not just about negative emotions. In fact, the final Killjoy survival tip in the second chapter, Surviving as a Feminist Killjoy, is feel everything, including Killjoy joy. And so that chapter does include a discussion of hope and wonder and joy as part of the Killjoy life. It's not, being a Killjoy is not about one emotion telling you what to do. It's about almost like listening to emotions as a set of somewhat confused messages about ourselves, about the worlds that we're in. Phenomenology, yeah, you know, I didn't train as a philosopher. I was really interested in the question of orientations and what was the relationship between sexual orientation, desire, and spatial orientation, our relationship between what's here and what's there. And if orientation was my question, phenomenology was one of the places I went to, because phenomenology makes orientation a starting point. So in a way, it was the questions that led me to phenomenology. And I just got to Husserl and found Husserl so much more interesting and actually quite exciting than I expected, because I'd kind of heard about, I'd read about phenomenology and was expecting all the interesting stuff about bodies to be in Merleau-Ponty. And I like Merleau-Ponty, but I was like, hang on a second, it's here actually in Husserl, especially in the second volume of Ideas. But it wasn't even that. It was just because I became obsessed with the table in Husserl's phenomenology. And when I wrote that book, Queer Phenomenology, it actually was supposed to be called Orientations. But another book, so they asked me to change the title. And I was originally not sure about using queer phenomenology because I was a bit worried that it would make that book it would make that book appear to be about a conversation with that philosophical tradition, which it is, but in a way the conversations weren't the point. The point lay elsewhere, with the objects such as the tables, the writing table and the kitchen table. And the feminist Killjoy doesn't appear in queer phenomenology. I described in the handbook how that book set the table for the feminist Killjoy, giving them the space they needed to appear.
Great. Okay, I'm thinking, since we have just a few minutes left, I think I'm going to take this question from Yana, who asks, does the Killjoys work ever end? And maybe to also ask this question as a way of inviting you to share what work you're up to next.
Does the Killjoys work ever end? Does the feminist work ever end? I mean, I think the Killjoy exists in relationship to what already exists. You Killjoy because of what already exists. It's something I stress a lot more probably towards the end of living a feminist life than I do in the Feminist Killjoy Handbook. So the Killjoys' work does not end to the extent that the institutions that promise happiness but reproduce violence persist. So whether or not the work of the Killjoy ends is dependent upon what actually happens in the world as we keep pushing against it. So I don't think being a Killjoy at work means being a Killjoy is all that you do or all that you are. It's one way of thinking about the work that we do. And of course, I know there's risks in becoming so connected to that particular figure. I've got Feminist Killjoy Handbook, a Feminist Killjoy blog, Feminist Killjoy t-shirts, badges. I can even hear myself saying blah, blah, blah. You know, rolling eyes equals feminist pedagogy. There is a sense that if you keep using the figure to do more and more and more, she can do less. The way in which diversity is often used more because it does less, or maybe it does less because it's used more. So there's a risk in overusing the Killjoy that, like any figure that begins really its political career from negation, a judgment about what something like, there's a risk that that negativity gets lost. And so we have to keep, pushing. And that's why I really stress Killjoy commitments. In terms of I'm just going to look at that question about staying in institution, teaching new students, and also the life question. What am I doing now with my work and my life? Well, no one asked me about what I'm doing with my life. I've just put it in there. It was a very difficult choice in a way to leave my post, but at another level, it didn't really feel like a choice. It felt like something I just had to do. I didn't understand when I resigned so publicly that I basically ended my academic career. Like I wouldn't be able to get an academic job in the UK. As a whistleblower, you're just not going to get back in. And I hope that I would have still made the same decision because it was the politically right thing to do. So I've talked a lot more in my current book, A Complainer's Handbook, about what it felt like to leave the institution in that way. But I also very much aware that I'm now freer to express myself. And I'm thinking I've written a Complainer's Handbook where I sort of pull some of the stories that I shared in my book, Complaint, and they are very much based on the university and are about the university. I've tried to pull them away from the university and think about what did they teach us about the workplace and some of the challenges that we have in dealing with harassment and bullying in different workplaces. Because wherever I've spoken about complaint, people have said to me, Sara, this doesn't just happen at university. And I know it doesn't just happen at university. So I really wanted to be able to sort of pull the stories out a little bit more from that side to think about what they might teach us about the difficulty of changing institutions. So although I am no longer working at an institution, I'm still committed to the project of changing them. And that is also one of the reasons I'm now working on common sense, because I'm very, very interested in the way in which a lot of the work we do, diversity and equality work, is seen as woke, as damaging legacies, but also as an alienation from reality. And so I'm very, very interested in how reality has been re-weaponized and common sense is now appealed to as what those of us who ask questions about what it means to be a man or a woman, what it means to have a body, what anything means really. Those of us who question are seen as estranged from common sense and reality, and I just want to sort of work out what's going on there. So I still remain committed to sort of doing feminist work, and I have to say that when I never did a book tour before, because you don't tend to do them. I didn't tend to do them ever before. I never thought of even doing a book tour. So when I did the Feminist Killjoy Handbook, it was the first time I'd ever done a book tour. And what I really loved about it was that, you know, I was speaking in bookshops like the one that we encountered each other at, and speaking at theatres and speaking in museums and libraries. And, you know, I really, really loved being able to share the work in these kinds of spaces because, you know, I will always remain connected to universities and to other students and teachers who work there. But that's not the only place to do intellectual work. And sometimes the history of these institutions can feel very cramped as we sit around, we talk in a lecture theatre with its hierarchical structure. And it's been really quite important to me, I think, to actually be able to share the work in these very different community-led spaces. So I'm really pleased to have been able to do that. And I hope to be able to do that more. And I'm also thinking, this is the last thought, I'm also thinking that as I've been going on in my writing, I've become, I suppose my academic writing has become less academic, or the kind of like there's a way in which the language has begun to take a lead. It's become more interested in poetry and sort of the lyrical quality of writing, more interested in sound and repetition and rhyme. But I'm also sort of thinking a little bit about maybe writing a bit more creatively. So I'm no longer thinking about books, and I'm thinking about maybe even turning something into a kind of play or something quite theatrical, because you can imagine all the tables and the doors and the corridors and the windows and blinds that come down. It would kind of work quite well in a more theatrical setting.